Welcome everyone, Office Hours episode 6. I'm your host, Davis Hunt. If you haven't been to the show before, we do this every week. We run a daily newsletter out of Nashville, Tennessee, covering arts, culture, politics, business, etc. It's kind of modeled off the old school alt weekly model that you might be familiar with. In Nashville, we have the Nashville Scene, and the Pamphleteer is the modern iteration of the Nashville Scene, just digital. We send out newsletters daily. You can sign up for our website for our newsletters at pamphleteer.co. And yeah, so typically how we structure these shows, I start out the show, I give a rundown of the previous week of Pamphleteer coverage. I hit all the high notes, make sure that you kind of get a sample of what we put in the newsletter. Really, this show is an extension of the newsletter. We've got two other shows. Tomorrow, Megan Podsiedlik does her Nashville Savvy, which focuses on her coverage over the past week. Tomorrow, she's going to be talking a lot about the public safety special session that ended on, I guess Tuesday. It ended on Tuesday, I think. Maybe Monday. It ended Monday. Jared has a show on Friday. Jared's our cultural critic. He writes most of our film reviews, does some investigative journalism, things like that. He'll have a guest on his show. So they do their shows at noon on Thursday and Friday, and I do mine at 7 p.m. at night. But you can always catch this as a recording, which is likely what you're doing. So let's get into it. This past week at the Pamphleteer, the first one of the things that's been going on, as you probably know, is the mayor's race between Alice Raleigh and Freddie O'Connell. And I wrote a column at the beginning of this week about who each candidate speaks to and for. O'Connell is more, as much as O'Connell has represented himself as a grassroots of the people candidate, O'Connell, more so than Raleigh, speaks to the entrenched interests of the city. I'm not going to go into depth on this. Suffice it to say, his response to a question during the Belmont Forum at the end of last week is a good example of how he tends to frame things and who he speaks to. He was asked about the use of SRO, security resource officers, in schools, and what he thought about the state forcing local public schools to install these to protect kids and students from malignant threats. This all came in the aftermath of the Covenant Massacre, and O'Connell's answer was he didn't directly answer whether or not schools should have SROs. He instead focused on how the state should not be mingling in the city's business and how the state has cared for the schools well, in particular, paying teachers more. It's a line that he brings up consistently, is referring to how much more he's going to pay people in city government and this kind of thing. It betrays his alliances. Ultimately, in my opinion, it kind of undermines the patina of his platform, which is one of transformation, even if he doesn't say that directly and even downplays it. He presents himself as this different kind of candidate who's not going to play hanky-panky with billionaires and the tourist industry. And needless to say, I'm skeptical. So we published something on that if you want to read that in the newsletter. Next up, where child ends and adult begins. So this is in reaction to a common trope that's bandied about when people are arguing over gun legislation. One of the lines that people have trotted out recently is that gun violence is the #1 cause of death for American children. And this is mostly not true. If you look at children between the ages of 0 and 17, the #1 cause of death is in infants under the age of 1, natural causes, birth deformities, abnormalities, etc. So if we remove that, typically how this is measured to make this stat palatable is they measure deaths and their causes between the ages of 1 and 19 or 1 and 18. Either one of those will turn up that homicide or suicide, I suppose, is the #1 cause of death for children in these age brackets. It almost entirely skews toward the upper end of that spectrum. 16 and up mostly. 16 to 19, 16 to 18 are where most of these crimes are committed. The highest profile instances of juveniles committing crimes, or children, depending on how you define them, the CDC I think goes up to 19, is the kidnapping and murder of Eliza Fletcher in Memphis, which was perpetrated by a juvenile who had committed a litany of crimes, and the live-streamed Facebook killing where the guy shot 4 people randomly. He was a 19-year-old that had recently been let out on bond. So that stat tries to connect gun violence to specifically infants. And it's understandable why they do that, because in the wake of the Covenant tragedy, where 3 9-year-olds were killed, this is emotionally resonant. And I've talked at length and written at length about Covenant and that whole thing. I have connections to that church. I grew up going to church there. I've talked about this before, so it's not for lack of empathy that I say any of this. But if laws are going to be passed, they must be passed rationally and have a basis in reality, and not based on a false construction of that reality. And this disinformation, I suppose you could call it, is misleading, and I think would lead to bad legislation. Cameron Sexton actually put up a couple of bills that were meant to deal with juveniles kind of committing crimes, and their sentencing, if they were on the brink of turning 18 or something or another, that addressed this stuff directly. It, of course, did not get passed during special session. We'll get into that here in a bit. The next special session, that's showbiz, baby. The reason I call it showbiz is because of this. Watch this. Oh, that's actually the wrong clip. Previous to this clip, Justin Pearson and Justin Jones had gathered around Cameron Sexton with signs and were trying to, sorry, my phone's ringing. We're trying to rile him up, I suppose. And there was an altercation, a question of who pushed who. There was a crowd. Pearson was crowding Sexton with a sign. Sexton gets pushed from behind. He leans into Pearson. It looks like someone pushed someone. There was a big debate. People were talking about how Pearson should press charges against Sexton. Sexton was saying that he pushed him. I mean, it's really kind of kindergarten level drama here. Here's a better clip that I have that's more exemplary.
Follow my finger here, but see Representative Justin Jones tossing up and then shouting up to the gallery up ahead. And Representative Justin Jones is, wow, he's grabbing the gavel and hitting it. I mean, I have to say that I believe that this is pretty unprecedented. I can't, at least for my own sake, ever remember a time.
So, the whole special session was set up. I'll get to the 4 bills that were passed, but I'm just going to comment from a 10,000-foot view on what it actually accomplished, which was giving Justin Jones and Justin Pearson something of a stage to prance across and make their case for being promoted to politics in D.C. I called them. It's like they're off-Broadway actors trying to get on Broadway, which is Washington, D.C., except they don't have the talent to get there, so they resort to these kind of infantile outbursts just to get attention. The whole thing is designed with the media in mind. They know how their actions are going to be perceived. They're not smart enough to understand that they can be sophisticated about it or even imaginative enough to do something like Donald Trump does, which is mix humor with this kind of dark underbelly that he is bringing you into, and you're on the journey with him to help uncover the corrupt lattice work of swamp creatures in D.C. And if you vote for Trump, you're going to help him overturn the deep state. They're not even that. They can't even conceive of weaving a narrative like that. It's all it is white supremacists, and you have to elect us because these guys are white supremacists. They don't have any narrative skills that allow them to bring people in. Kind of a weird critique, but you have to understand that, politics is show business for ugly people. And so if we're going to take that for granted, we have to judge them on their theatrical merits. And in my opinion, Justin Pearson and Justin Jones fail. They are bad actors. They are not entertaining. Tennessee deserves better. We deserve good performances. We deserve these grand narratives. If we're going to talk about corruption in the state, it needs to be this complicated web that you can just totally immerse yourself in. Anyway, Trump does a good job of that. Say what you will about him, but he does. So the 4 bills that were passed, very simple bills. People will debate all week about this. Megan probably will have more information. Well, I know she will, actually. She'll have more information on this tomorrow. State must require free firearm locks to Tennessee residents. The TBI now has a 72-hour window in which they must deliver information to Metro Police Department, etc., when incidents occur. There's another bill which kind of is disconnected from all this, which requires the TBI to issue an annual report on child trafficking. And then the last is the bill that pays for the session and allocates some funds for school safety. And, weirdly enough, the allocation of security resource officers to schools seems like a pretty common sense approach. If you have people with guns in the community who may or may not go to schools, what do you do to prevent that? We're not going to do gun confiscations. That's out. That's just not going to happen. Whether you want it to or not, no one's going to go out and confiscate firearms. So the only way you can do that is you put armed guards between schools and the bad guys. So, all right. So this Nashville in the news. One interesting piece from Bloomberg that came out this week. New York and California each lost $1 trillion when financial firms moved south. This was over the past 3 or so years. See, during basically COVID has led to the migration of much financial businesses out of New York and California, as you can see on the screen, to states like Tennessee, Texas, and Florida. Most of it went to Florida. A decent portion went to Tennessee, and the rest went to Texas. Here's a slide that shows the gained funds, total assets under management. Tennessee actually ahead of Texas on this front. I think that's mostly due to Alliance Bernstein moving here from New York. But the exodus from the Northeast and West Coast has meant the loss of thousands of high-paying jobs, straining city and state finances by sapping tax revenue. This is for New York and California and the other coastal states. Commercial property markets have also lost value. Tenants at the same time, they've been struggling with new realities of hybrid work, etc. This is not a trend that's unique to observe, but it is something that I think you might see accelerate in a variety of forms as people choose to relocate into safer, cheaper places. The South is at this point way cheaper, and depends on where you live, but in a lot of areas safer than either New York or California. The moves, often born out of a desire for lower taxes, warm weather, and cheaper mansions, have pushed the industry's footprint into parts of the U.S. that previously didn't have much of a finance presence beyond regional banks. So this is definitely an interesting development, something to keep an eye on. Here you see on the right side the largest net gains and losses in investment jobs due to relocation. Texas at the top, Tennessee second, Connecticut, Florida, Rhode Island. Interesting trend, something to think about. Also in the national news, in Henderson, Tennessee, which is in West Tennessee, an FBI-involved shooting where a veteran's house was raided and he was killed, and there's not really much information on why they raided his house or anything. We don't know anything. What we do know is that the FBI did not communicate with the local police department, went straight into the guy's house, and basically executed him. His mother claims that he was not armed. If I were to put on my Civil War hat, I would say that this reminds me of the military occupation of the South post-Civil War. federal agency coming into a local municipality and enacting some and doing this is pretty disgusting and hard to stomach, to be honest with me. To be honest with you. So there's that. Moving on. Culture Corner. This is a highlight of all the cultural stuff that we covered this week. Nashville's best rum cocktails. Our resident cocktail critic, Valerie Malfi, wrote a review of some of Nashville's best rum cocktails and where you can find them. This is the Intercoastal at Cafe Rose. We've got the Waymore Guest House, which has this Just to Satisfy You. I, for one, am a big fan of rum and cokes. It's a pretty dirty, kind of trashy cocktail. I don't care, though. I like it. If it's not a pina colada, it's a rum and coke for me if I'm drinking rum. Fox Daiquiri, the Fox Bar and Cocktail Club. Anyway, we put out these things semi-frequently. We'll have another one on Friday, about more rum cocktails. You can tune into the newsletter to get that. Jared did an excellent review of Quentin Tarantino's new book, Cinema Speculation, which I would highly recommend. I've read the book. It's fantastic. It's basically a memoir of Quentin Tarantino's time growing up in Los Angeles and details how he got introduced to certain movies. There's some very cogent film history tied into there. One of the things that really stuck out to me when I was reading it was that the 80s were defined. The reason that 70s cinema was so robust and the 80s couldn't deliver on that was during the 80s, filmmakers, for whatever reason, kind of self-censored themselves. Maybe you had movies like Dirty Harry, Deliverance, a variety of movies that kind of raised the hackles on certain people's necks. And it seems like in the 80s, filmmakers decided to kind of step off the gas. Maybe the filmmakers of the time were getting older. They were, not as willing to be as edgy as they might have used to been in the past. And this created kind of a stultifying decade of film that was which led to the 90s, in which filmmakers began to kind of desensitize and censor themselves and produce probably one of the better decades of film, depending on who you ask. It reminds me of today. It seems like a lot of the censorship today, there is, of course, self-censorship. I think there's always some component in any art form where people are closing themselves off to certain ideas and opening themselves to others. And I do think certain eras are defined by more openness to ideas, whereas others are defined by closed offness to all ideas. What's different is that Hollywood has started to institutionalize a lot of this censorship. We've seen it with Amazon's criteria for what kind of movies they will fund and put on their platform, and Netflix, etc. So instead of it being kind of this like organic, decentralized artistic movement, for lack of a better word, even though it's weird for me, I don't like to call the Hollywood film industry an artistic movement, but I suppose it's got some of the similar dynamics. You're seeing the imposition of aesthetic and artistic standards onto the film industry from the top. And that's just one little anecdote. He has every film, the titles of the chapters are different movies. I went back and watched most of the movies that he mentions in the book. And I mean, it's like when you rewatch the movies that he's mentioned, you might have seen them before. Like I rewatched Bullet the other night with Steve McQueen. And his whole thing about Steve McQueen is that Steve McQueen was an unapologetic movie star. And I can't remember who the other movie stars were at the time. But McQueen was always like, if I don't have the lead role, I don't want to have anything to do with it. He was unabashedly arrogant about what his role in a movie should be. And he knew that he didn't have to say a lot. Like in Bullet, there's an hour of Bullet without lines. It's just car driving and Steve McQueen looking cool. He knew that he didn't need to say anything. He understood his role as a movie star, etc. A lot of good insight in that book. Jarrett does a great review on that. You can get that on our website. And lastly, a little note for people in Nashville. International Market, which closed in 2019, is reopened, and Southern Living has added it to their best new restaurants in the South rankings. If you remember the old International Market, it was like this dingy little grocery store / restaurant right off Belmont's campus. Still not in the exact same location, but across the street from where the old one used to be. It's a little spruced up now. I actually haven't been over there yet. Maybe I will now, but just want to put that on people's radars. So that's all we got for what happened last week at the Pamphleteer. I pre-recorded an interview with Tyler Hummel earlier today. Tyler wrote a great review on the movie The Everlasting Church. Gosh, my brain is just not working today. Let me look it up and confirm before we get to it. The Essential Church, which is a documentary about Grace Church and John MacArthur's efforts to keep their church open during during COVID. I'm going to play that interview now. Tyler penned a review for us recently of the movie The Essential Church, which we'll discuss here in a second. Tyler has contributed to us here and there. He's a film critic, local writer based out of the Nashville area. Antisocial critic without the C at the end. Antisocial Critty on Twitter. If you want to follow him there, let's bring him up. Tyler, thanks for joining me.
I love that Twitter handle. It's so incredibly awkward, but I've had it since my public access days, so I can't get rid of it now.
You've had it? Oh, yeah. You know, my old online tag used to be the Blender, and I don't know. Like when I used to play Age of Empires 2 online and all that stuff, I was the Blender. And, you know, I'm kind of curious to see if anyone on Twitter has that right now. There's Blender Studio, which I think is the main one, but hold on, I have to share this. This is too funny. Someone does have it, believe it or not. Hold on, how do I do this? Actually, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to share it. So, owner and blender at Daughters of Isis, aromacologist, ethnobotanical maker, teacher and occupier, catalog at online. What is aromacologist? Is that like aromas?
I would assume so. I don't know. This sounds eclectic enough that I could believe it's like your alt, but like I don't know.
Oh
like...
no, I'm not near. Yeah, it does look like aromatherapy associated things. The witch oils. Wow, she is the blender. See, when I called myself the blender, it was more like, you know, because it's got this kind of, you know, a blender has blades. It's supposed to be anyway.
Yeah. I'm thankful that I'm thankful that I'm still working in film criticism, because my title would make a lot less sense if I wasn't still a member of the Music City Film Critics Association and, you know, publishing film reviews regularly. Otherwise, it'd just be weird.
Yeah. Well, you could call your followers like critties or something. Antisocial critties. I don't know. Anyway, all right, let's talk about why we're here. So you wrote this, you pinned this review on this movie, The Essential Church. Tell us a bit about it. I haven't seen it. I thought your review, you know, I mean, your review kind of explains what the movie's about, but tell us about this movie, and it's related to COVID and lockdowns and why they released it now as opposed to a year ago, and why it's still relevant.
Well, in a lot of ways, it feels like it's trying to, you know, be the final word on this subject of the COVID lockdowns, because, well, they're still relevant for one. I mean, the lockdown emergency only ended about 6 months ago or so. So this is not like this isn't still something that we have to think about. I mean, effectively, people stopped enforcing them about a year and a half ago. But, to this day, I still got downtown in Nashville, and I'm seeing people with their masks on. So there are some, I guess I'd call them terminally online, but I guess more so just, you know, complete misanthropes, people that are just denying science at this point, who just say like, you know, the pandemic hasn't gone away. It's still here. Everyone's dying. I'm like, no, it's even the government doesn't believe that right now. They're probably going to believe it in a couple of months because it sounds like they're trying to drum up the paranoia again, which is basically but the movie is about why that paranoia is dangerous, because it's from the it was produced by, I believe, Grace Life Church, which is one of the largest non-denominational Christian churches in the U.S. It's based out of Los Angeles, and it's run by a man named John MacArthur, who is one of the most influential American Christians at the moment. And it documents his church's process of trying to figure out what to do in response to the COVID lockdown circa March 2020, the weeks that followed, how they initially decided that they were going to initially capitulate because no one knew what was happening in March 2020. Everyone's a little bit freaked out. Everyone's nervous. And at that point, it's understandable. Everyone was freaked out. And as time goes on, the church starts undoing the bounds a little bit and realizes that they need to kind of be there because they have church members that are dying, and they need the pastors to go spend some time and do end of life care. People are struggling not having their religious community around. So the church opens its door and says, if you want to wear a mask, you want hand sanitizers, we're going to leave it at the front door. You can do what you want. But naturally, the state of California is not conducive to these ideas, and it starts throwing lawsuits and cease and desist letters at the church. And eventually, after a long, long legal battle, years long, the church eventually does win, and they get about an $800,000 payout from the state of California. But this documentary is clear. This is not a isolated case of one overly litigious alderman or mayor or governor in this case. This is a global problem, and there's at least there's been dozens of pastors that have been arrested. Their churches have been locked up. One of the pastors in the movie they interview was from Canada. He was arrested for several days, and when he came back to his church, they had put barbed wire around his church so that he would not be able to enter the building, and they would not be able to open services until the government allowed him to. This is a massive enforcement against churches across North America, and I'm assuming it happened in Europe at some degree too. But people got away with it because this phrase of non-essential businesses became the meme in early 2020, and people just kind of got it in their head that if something is non-essential, we're going to keep it closed for a while. But who's defining non-essential? What does non-essential mean? No one talked about these things. It's one thing to say, let's not congregate 30 old people in a contained space for 3 weeks without any sort of understanding of what's happening with this virus. It's another thing entirely 2 to 3 months after the virus outbreak, when we have an idea of how the transmission is happening, when we have ideas of what this is and how we can deal with it, at least marginally, because people were starting to go back out after about 3 months. At that point, there's no argument for that the government can put take a big stamp and put the word non-essential on the front door of the church, Martin Luther style. That's not their position. In fact, it's actually, and as the movie makes it clear, it's actually a form of spiritual violence against the church and against the people who value their spiritual lives as a major cornerstone of their life. It's not politely asking people to, be smart, don't do something stupid during a pandemic. It's not, let's be careful. It's the government actively saying religion is non-essential. It is the government actively coming in and saying and trampling on people's right to make their own decisions, to decide whether or not this is important enough that they're willing to take that risk, and then destroying lives in the process. The long effect of it has been that American religion is it's only made the long-term collapse of American religion move faster. I mean, the statistic I found in the review is that church attendance has dropped from 55% in America to 45% or something along those lines. And the fact that we've let that happen on a nationwide scale just speaks to the fact that a lot of churches let people put the unessential label on them. And then guess what happens? People believe it.
That was a trend that preceded the pandemic, though. It just was accelerated by this.
I mean, religious life in America has been declining since about 1990. I mean, that's roughly when you start seeing the massive drop-offs in religious attendance and the slow decline from 80% of people saying they're Christian to 60, 70, and now it's probably down in like the 30s, 40s. And
well, what I was thinking about today, thinking about your article, was just revisiting in my head this whole thing about essential, non-essential, and what we define as essential and non-essential. And I was thinking about the core essential activities, and it's eating, drinking, sleeping, and I'm not gonna curse, using the bathroom. So, I mean, those are like the 4 essential activities, and they've like what when during the pandemic, I was really into Giorgio Agamben, the Italian philosopher, and he has this whole kind of series of ideas around the reduction of life to its most bare form, and that's the ultimate tyranny of the modern world, is that we can't account for the unaccountable, like the value of worship or the value of fellowship and this kind of thing. And I don't know. I was trying to think about what would have to change in order for the leadership class, I suppose, to categorize things like communing with others, not even maybe even in a religious context. But it's also weird, and you mentioned this in the article, sorry, this is kind of a meandering point, but you mentioned how the permission was given to go protest for racial grievance reasons, like the Summer of Floyd, as I like to call it, and others, was seen as more essential than church. Do you think that's a statement of kind of like of a religious priority? They see the mission of liberating people from the chains of racism or whatever vestiges of it there are now as more essential than worshiping God?
it definitely speaks to their religious system, because obviously religion doesn't die. People still have these categories of spiritual thinking in their head. There's a reason why like Wicca is one of the most popular trends on TikTok right now, because the moment you banish one religion from your head, another one just creeps in and just takes over your thinking, takes over your priorities, how you look at the world. And that's obviously what happened. I mean, I don't mean to impugn actual cases of people, being hurt by the cops, and in recent years, I'm more sympathetic to that, but those problems. But it definitely speaks to the fact that we have this religious reverence for the subject of oppression, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But it speaks to it also that we don't have that for actual religion. That we can tell how millions and millions of American Christians to go home and don't come back, and it doesn't make a difference to them. Ultimately, they don't care. They don't think it's not that high of a priority for them. Or they think that, or they think that categorically, it's okay to be gone from church for 2 months. What's the worst that can happen? But it just tells you about where their emotional investment and their reverence are as people. They haven't stopped worshiping their ideas, or whatever ideas that are at the heart of their moral system. They've just misplaced them. It's like a reverse hierarchy.
Tell us about the public reception to this movie.
I can't speak to that super well, because the movie doesn't seem to have made that much of a dent. It kind of was in and out of theaters in about a week, but I did note when it did come out that it was more popular than The Flash. The Flash came in number 18, which I thought was very funny. But again, being
it was more popular
behind
than The Flash.
The Flash, that's the new Warner Brothers DC Comics superhero movie that completely bombed in June. So, but even then, like, coming in right behind a 2-month-old blockbuster that no one went and saw is not the earth-shaking performance that I think that the studio wanted. They made about $200,000, I think. I think they opened up internationally afterwards. They probably made it up to 300 or so. And now it's on DVD, so I'm sure they're probably making some additional sales off that as well. So I can't tell you what the actual cultural impact of the film is going to be, but it seems to be that, more than anything, it's just part of a trend of right-wing Christian filmmakers kind of going to the outside of the film market to sell their stuff. Because we had the Dinesh D'Souza documentary last year. It was like, we're gonna let you rent it on locals, and Dennis Prager has a documentary, and it seems like every right-wing personality or Christian personality ends up with a documentary at some point.
Yeah.
Just because there's enough of an contrarian market to make that happen. But I mean, obviously,
It's
this wasn't
it's like selling merch. If you're a right-wing influencer, you might start off selling merch, but at some point you sell a documentary and a book too. But it's just all part of the accoutrement of being an influencer, I suppose.
Yeah, there's varying levels of egocentrism involved in it too. Like I can always, my judge of any right-wing documentary is how much does it turn into an autobiography, because that tells you a lot about where the filmmakers' heads are.
Like 2000 Mules, for example, I just love the action shots of Dinesh D'Souza on his laptop in his kitchen, and then he's on the phone, and talking to his wife, and man, those shots in that documentary are just so funny to me.
Well, that tells you that right there where Dinesh D'Souza is at, but I can at least understand why the man who was wrongly arrested for a year for paying $2,000 to a senator under the table might have some residual bitterness to him. But but at least in the case of this documentary, I felt like the egocentrism was somewhat muted, because they're obviously Christians. So I think for the most part, they're interested in centering the documentary on their faith. And it's not just one guy. They have John MacArthur, the entire elder staff from that church, multiple interviewees from different churches who have been arrested. So there's a relatively sizable ensemble, and it's better focused than a lot of those documentaries are, just because I think that they have their priorities a little bit more in order than a lot of these style of documentary.
Well, tell us about John MacArthur, the man at I mean, he's probably, I haven't seen the movie, but judging by your review, he's the leader of the church. He's the one out on Fox News bragging about how his church has refused to close, that kind of thing. Tell us about him. Is he I don't know. I guess the obvious question is he grifting off of this, or do you think that he's got pure intentions?
I mean, I can't read the cockles of his heart, but I would assume that he's probably got his head in the right place. I mean, MacArthur's the kind of celebrity pastor. If you go to Barnes and Noble, you'll find copies of his books floating around, because he's kind of the New York Times best-selling Christian pastor, celebrity pastor. So you can find all of his sermons on YouTube. Like he's a very, very large voice in contemporary Protestantism. So it's not hard to kind of get a sense of what his vibe is. It's definitely not the Joel Osteen prosperity gospel vibe. I think that the way he talks and preaches, I get the sense he does really want to put his beliefs first. And even in the documentary, he wrestles a little bit with it. He's clearly not sure what to do for the most part, but once he has his ducks in order, he understands what the direction needs to go in. He commits to it. He knows that there's no turning back point. And he says, if we go further than this, we're going to be at war with the state of California. And he says, let's do it, which is, brave. The church could have been fined out of existence had they not played their cards right and gotten the right legal and agencies involved. Because at that point, there was no legal precedent to defend the church. At that point, like most of the lawsuits that have been coming up from smaller churches were winding up in the court system and just getting bounced. So these churches were getting fined out of existence, but they held the line and they did well. So I don't know if it's an ego trip for him. I definitely think going on Fox News, whatever you think of them, is definitely more of a we know who our audience is, and we know who's going to support us if we go talk to them kind of thing. Because obviously, there's a lot of money in boomer conservatism, but there are times where you wonder, it's like, okay, is he doing this because they're the only ones that want to talk to him, or is he doing this because he knows they're going to amplify his message? So you don't always know, but I would assume he's at least mostly got his head in the right spot.
What's the tone of the documentary? I mean, tell us about it aesthetically. How does it set up?
It's fairly bleak at times, at least in terms of tone and atmosphere.
Or sorry, what's the narrative? does
Sorry?
it follow him, or does it like who? How is it set up? Are we just hearing John MacArthur talk the whole time about
No,
his?
no, it's structured around multiple interviews with all the figures involved. So it'll dart between them. It's separated more or less into chapters. So each one kind of talks about a different subject or a different moral justification. There's a lot of, especially in the second half, there's a lot of talk about the theology of civil disobedience, of what legitimate theologically what is the legitimate excuse for when you should or should not obey the government, which is a difficult subject, and they go
Right.
pretty in depth into that in a way that's not probably conducive to a mainstream documentary. Like they pretty much lay out the case for why theologically they're doing it, and in no uncertain terms. But
What do you remember? Some of the arguments that were the theological arguments made for?
I don't recall the verses, but there's essentially Christian doctrine says you're supposed to render unto Caesar. You're as a Christian, you are not supposed to be a violent revolutionary who's completely overthrowing the system. You're supposed to obey it until the moment it tells you to disobey God. And the movie makes it very clear that when the government's telling you to break your worship beliefs, not minister to people, that's actively a violation of that rule. And at that point, civil obedience is understandable, and even potentially martyrdom is, the ultimate is worth doing. Which, I mean, that's the logic of why people went to the lions originally in ancient Rome, because we're not going to compromise our beliefs at all. There's an example the movie keeps going back to the film of a famous story from Scotland in the 1630s. I believe the woman's name was Jenny Geddes, and it's a very famous Presbyterian story of when the Church of England began trying to enforce their liturgical standards on the Scottish people, which obviously the Scots don't like the English, and they don't like their religion, and they don't like their church. So the Scots started complaining, and the Church of England said, we're going to do it anyway because the England rules you. And it basically caused a peasant revolt because the peasants said, we're not going to compromise our religious standards to obey you. And it ended up causing mass executions of Presbyterians in the 1630s, and eventually it spiraled out of control into the English Civil War, where the Puritans took over and basically ransacked a large section of England, which, me being Anglican, I don't particularly appreciate. But it's one of those things where the movie lost me a little bit with that example, even just on a moral example, because it's such a melodramatic example of when the government's going after you. Because I don't think that's not exactly what the federal government was doing in this case. The government's not dumb enough nowadays to actively go out and just start shooting Christians in the streets. It knows that the best way you can kind of undermine their power is just to embarrass them slightly until they don't say anything, which is more or less what it does to bully you. It doesn't. If Biden started like dragging pastors out into the streets and shooting them for minor transgressions of the status quo, people would start getting martyred left and right, and they would lose their power a little bit. But the fact that the documentary kind of uses it uses that example repeatedly, like from it starts that way in the introduction, and it keeps just waving back references to it throughout the entire thing. So like there are parts of it that I don't particularly like or think work in its favor, but the very least I think the point it's making about the church being unessential is salient.
Yes, yeah. I mean, like the quote that you have in here. Sorry, I'm scrolling to it. However, a government that has the power to tell the churches that they are unessential to modern life while Costco and protest marches are defended has crossed a serious moral and spiritual line, one that the filmmakers argue qualifies as a form of spiritual warfare. The documentary goes as far as to suggest such actions have a whiff of the satanic about them, saying the evil powers of the world are using the government, intentionally or not, to oppress the church. I mean, I feel like it's there's certainly a case to be made for that. I'll say that. And well, Tyler, thank you so much for chatting with me. That's all the time we got. You can read Tyler's review on the Pamphleteer website. It's up at the top there. Tyler's got another article coming out for us in a couple of weeks. We'll keep that one secret until we release it. Tyler, thanks a lot. We'll talk to you soon. Stick around, and I'll say goodbye. All right, that's Tyler Hummel. Back to the show. All right, guys. Well, that's our show for the week. Thank you for tuning in. We'll be back next week. I'm still working on guests, but as usual, we'll do the same old thing. Appreciate you tuning in. See you soon.